Employment is a funny type of thing, right? Because when we talk about employment, when we talk about the workplace, particularly in the context of relationships, I'm sure it conjures up a variety of different emotions, a variety of different feelings. For me, I can find work either this joyful, exhilarating, vibrant place where I find my purpose, my calling, I feel like I'm really contributing and belonging. And at other times, I can really find it a slog. Like every day, I'm forcing myself out of bed to turn up, to show up, to do good work, and the rest of it that comes with employment. Employment is really, really hard. And I think it's a little bit different to other relationships that we're going to be talking about throughout this series. You know, we talked about friendship, we talked about dating, we will be talking about family. Charles Nicky talking about family parenting next week. Now, the thing with work is that you're kind of forced into these relationships, right? You're forced to suddenly spend an awful lot of time. If you've got a normal 9 to 5 sort of job with 5 days a week, that's a huge amount of time spent with strangers that you kind of have to get along with. And you have to get along with them because you have to work together. You have to find mutual ways of achieving the things that you're paid to do. And at the same time, you have this very bizarre thing, which is an external pressure to be seen in a certain light, which you don't really get with friends, right? Friends kind of accept you for who you are. Your family sees the best and worst of you, but they love you, right? They're going to put up with you. But in a work context, it is slightly different. In a work context, we are faced with people who can be a little bit rough around the edges, people who perhaps aren't very nice to us, people who don't perhaps value us as much as we think we should, be valued. And so we have this external pressure. And as we get into the passage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work through it verse by verse. I'm going to call out some of the things that I think Paul is calling us to in the context of work. Now, before I do that, I just want to cover a couple of quick things. Firstly, the reality of the workplace. Now, for some of you, you'll have jobs where you feel genuinely fulfilled. You feel like your strengths are being used to the best of their ability. You'll feel like the people that you work with are more like family and friends than they are colleagues. And for others, you'll find work really hard. You'll kind of be asking yourself, what's the point? Why do I turn up day in, day out? Put my guts into it. For what? And I want to recognize that those emotions are real. But what happens is that those pressures that we put on ourselves, right? The pressure to perform, the pressure to be acknowledged by the external world in the role that you have, that can sometimes seep in to the way that we deal with our colleagues, the relationships that we form at work, the way we interact with our boss or our line manager. Being an employee can be really hard. I also want to acknowledge the external pressures that are placed on us to find value and worth and meaning in our roles. Has anyone heard of the LinkedIn effect? The LinkedIn effect is where you've got a job, whatever your job might be, and you give yourself the most ridiculous title just to make yourself sound amazing, right? I was trying to define one for my wife, who's a stay-at-home mum. I came up with this: a multidisciplinary executive in residence specializing in nutrition, logistics, conflict resolution, emotional support, education, and crisis management. I think that's it. Thank you. That one's for you, Claire. But we all do it, right? We all kind of try and make ourselves look better and give ourselves grander titles than perhaps our roles permit. In fact, I think a lot of us will often talk about imposter syndrome for exactly the same reason. I've got a good friend of mine who's a Christian. I used to work with him, probably one of the best leaders I've ever met. He now teaches leadership basically for a living. And yet he once said to me, he really feels like an imposter. I couldn't believe it, but I very quickly learned that a lot of us feel like we have this imposter thing, like we're given this job that we're not quite capable of, but we're not quite sure why. And then I came across this post on LinkedIn the other day, which I just thought was brilliant. It said this: my biggest fear is that I'll be found out at work. The only thing is I don't know what I'm hiding. I don't know if you ever get that kind of sense of kind of like, I kind of worry that people are going to find out that I'm not quite the person I should be. I'm not quite the leader that I aspire to be. I'm not quite as proficient in my job as I should be. My knowledge isn't quite as deep as sort of people assume it is. But actually we kind of grapple for that thing because we kind of get through our job. It's kind of okay. And this is the thing, it's this pressure, this invisible pressure we put on ourselves to perform. John Stott, the theologian, says the real test of someone's Christian profession isn't in the church, but in the workplace. Now, before we get into the passage, before we start to look at how Paul is calling us to behave in a work context, let's firstly remember who we are. Let's ground this in our identity in Christ. Because if we don't get that right, the rest is utterly pointless, so you might as well switch off. Because the difference with a Christian mindset when it comes to work is our starting point is grace. Our starting point is grace. And if we recognize that, then the way that we view our roles, the way that we view the relationships that we form at work are utterly different. You see, as Christians, we recognize that you don't need to earn God's approval. You already have it. And in the same way, when you turn up at the office to work, you're not working for acceptance. You're working from a place of acceptance. Because Christ has already accepted you for who you are, warts and all, and he's made you clean. I think a lot of us worry about impressing the boss, pleasing our colleagues, making sure that we're pulling our weight. We worry about being liked in the workplace. Do people think I'm smart? Do people like me? Do they want to invite me to the pub after work? But we need to recognize that we are not on trial. See, that trial has already been taking place. And Christ has already given you a verdict. Righteous in his eyes, because he has clothed you in his righteousness.